while they're releasing survivors, they're protecting the men who raped them or who covered up the abuse.
Charlene Richard, is that how you're experiencing it? Well, I see you nodding.
Yeah, that's honestly how I'm experiencing it. For full transparency to be considered and for trust to be restored with the American people and with us as survivors, people need to understand that this is not just about us and these files. This is about all of America and how we've been treated in the justice system. We're protecting predators and not children. We were children at this time, and that's why we held up our pictures in the PSA. And this is just deplorable that they're even releasing some of our names, that there's so many redactions, and just for everybody to
listen to this survivor speak those words with absolute moral clarity, cutting through the manufactured noise and bureaucratic obfuscation like a scalpel, exposing gangrenous tissue, and understand we are witnessing something far more profound than a simple document dump or another news cycle scandal, because one Epstein survivor told CNN that she believes the Department of Justice was protecting themselves, not the victims, after experiencing the catastrophic failure of justice that the release of these so-called Epstein files represents. And this is not hyperbole. This is not partisan exaggeration. This is the documented reality that the Trump administration is violating federal law to protect the rich and powerful. According to lawmakers who note that it took an act of Congress to force Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, and Dan Bongino to even consider providing justice, and what we're seeing unfold in real time is a masterclass in how power protects itself through the architecture of selective transparency, where the powerful deploy the rhetoric of openness while simultaneously constructing elaborate mechanisms to ensure that nothing fundamentally threatening to the established order ever sees the light of day, because this administration, despite its performative claims about releasing everything, despite the White House framing this as evidence of unprecedented transparency, has produced only about 10% of the files, with half of that already released, and the other 5% highly redacted, which means we're getting crumbs while survivors are told to be grateful for the privilege of watching their abusers remain unnamed and unaccountable. The survivor in this clip, Charlene Richard, speaks with devastating precision when she says we're protecting predators and not children, and she's holding up photographs of herself as a child to force us to confront the visceral reality that these were not abstract crimes against faceless statistics, but systematic, brutal violations of actual human beings who were children when powerful men decided their bodies were commodities to be traded in. The economy of elite impunity. And this matters because Epstein survivors have taken issue with the handling of the release, contending that disclosures have been incomplete and improperly redacted, with more than a dozen survivors raising concerns about abnormal and extreme redactions with no explanation, and some victims' identities left unredacted, causing real and immediate harm, which means the Department of Justice is simultaneously hiding the names of perpetrators while exposing the identities of victims in a perverse inversion of what any reasonable person would understand justice to require. And this is not incompetence. This is not bureaucratic error. This is strategic protection of power masquerading as procedural caution. When she says this is about all of America and how we've been treated in the justice system, she's articulating a truth that extends far beyond the Epstein case, because what we're witnessing is the crystallization of a two-tiered system of justice that operates with such brazen contempt for democratic accountability that it doesn't even bother to hide itself anymore. And the philosophical foundations here draw directly from what scholars of elite impunity have identified as the structural impossibility of holding powerful people accountable when the very institutions designed to enforce accountability are themselves captured by the interests they're supposed to regulate, because Congress passed a law forcing the Trump administration to release the files, and yet even with explicit legal mandates, even with bipartisan pressure, even with survivors standing on Capitol steps demanding justice, the administration simply chose to ignore the deadline, knowing that the mechanisms of enforcement are so weak and so compromised that they could violate federal law with relative impunity. And here's where this gets absolutely explosive, because a 2020 email from a prosecutor in New York revealed that flight logs showed Donald Trump flew on Epstein's private jet many more times than was previously known, or that the government was aware, and this is in the files that were just released, meaning this information has been sitting in government hands for years, while Trump built a political career partly on conspiracy theories about other people's connections to Epstein, while his own extensively documented relationship remained conveniently obscured. At least 16 files that were released Friday appeared to have been removed from the website, including a photo containing an image of President Donald Trump, before being restored only after public pressure, which tells you everything you need to know about whose interests this controlled disclosure is designed to serve, because when files start disappearing, when photos of the president get scrubbed from databases, when more than 680 pages of documents were entirely redacted. According to NBC News analysis, we're not talking about protecting victims, we're talking about protecting perpetrators and their enablers. The historical parallel here demands articulation because we've seen this pattern before in every major crisis of institutional legitimacy, from Watergate to Iran-Contra to the financial crisis of 2008, where the architecture of accountability collapses under the weight of elite protection, and what scholars describe as the crisis of elite impunity manifests when those with power can cause massive harm without facing consequences, creating what research identifies as extra-legal spaces where social harms are perpetrated on vast scales, benefiting tiny groups while nobody is held legally accountable, and this produces sedimenting episodes of impunity that eventually generate legitimacy crises because democracy and impunity are fundamentally incompatible, and when ordinary citizens watch the powerful operate above the law, while they themselves face the world's largest and harshest penal system for trivial infractions, the social contract disintegrates. Now lawmakers, including Democratic Rep. Ro Khanna, who called the release a slap in the face of survivors, and Republican Thomas Massie, are threatening to hold Attorney General Pam Bondi in contempt because the Justice Department hasn't released key documents that survivors are seeking that implicate the rich and powerful men who visited Epstein's rape island and covered up the abuse. And this bipartisan outrage should tell you something about how egregious this violation is, because these are not natural political allies, but the sheer brazenness of the cover-up has forced even ideologically opposed lawmakers to recognize that something fundamentally corrupted is happening. Democratic lawmakers Robert Garcia and Jamie Raskin stated that Trump's administration and Attorney General Pam Bondi were violating federal law after attempting to conceal facts and evidence about the deceased child abuser Jeffrey Epstein, with the files legally mandated to be released but instead delivered in fragments with extreme redactions that mock the very concept of transparency. The survivor says people need to understand that this is not just about us and these files, and she's absolutely right, because what's at stake here is whether we live in a society where justice is a meaningful concept or merely a rhetorical device deployed to pacify the masses, while the powerful construct elaborate systems to ensure their own immunity from consequences. And this connects to broader patterns of how sexual violence and abuse get systematically protected when perpetrators occupy positions of power, because the release included an FBI document describing a 1996 criminal complaint against Epstein related to allegations of child pornography, with Farmer's lawyer confirming the complaint was made by her client, indicating that law enforcement was aware of allegations against Epstein a decade before he was first arrested in 2000, nothing for an entire decade, while Epstein continued to abuse and traffic children, and this is the same government now claiming they need to heavily redact documents to protect victims, while survivors are screaming that they're being re-traumatized by seeing their own names unredacted, while their fedgers remain anonymous. While the philosophical architecture of power protection operates through what we might call the bureaucracy of opacity, where institutions deploy procedural complexity and claims of legal necessity to obscure fundamentally political choices about who deserves protection and who deserves exposure, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer criticized the heavily redacted documents as just a fraction of the whole body of evidence, stating that simply releasing a mountain of blacked-out pages violates the spirit of transparency and the letter of the law. And when Schumer points out a 119-page document in the files that was completely blacked out, we need to ask what possible victim protection justification exists for entirely redacting 119 consecutive pages unless what's being protected is not victims, but perpetrators, and the systems that enabled them, because survivors noted that no financial documents were released, and grand jury minutes approved by a federal judge for release were fully blacked out with 119 full pages redacted, not scattered redactions to protect victim names, but complete blackouts with hundreds of thousands of pages of documents still unreleased. And here's what should make your blood absolutely boil, because while they're releasing heavily redacted fragments, a Jeffrey Epstein survivor, who has only ever chosen to identify herself anonymously as Jane Doe, was startled to learn that her name appeared multiple times unredacted in the Justice Department's release of the Epstein files, and her attempts to get the DOJ to redact her name from publicly available documents had been unsuccessful, which means the Department of Justice had the time and resources to meticulously redact the names of powerful perpetrators, but somehow lacked the basic competence or care to protect the identity of a survivor who explicitly never wanted to be publicly named. And this is not bureaucratic incompetence. This is structural violence, where the machinery of justice operates to compound the trauma of victims while shielding abusers and survivors. CNN spoke with said they have not been contacted by the Justice Department about the Epstein files, despite the DOJ's claims about protecting victims, which tells you everything about whose protection actually matters to this administration. The Trump administration's handling of this release represents a case study in how fascistic tendencies manifest not through dramatic ruptures, but through the mundane corruption of institutional processes, where the rule of law becomes selectively applied based on proximity to power, because Trump, who's been dogged by his administration's handling of the files, ultimately backed the release after members of his own party helped force a vote in the House to compel their release, which means he only agreed under massive political pressure, and even then, Trump administration officials said they were convinced there wouldn't be anything in the files that showed President Donald Trump did anything illegal, which is a remarkable statement of confidence given that after a first batch of Epstein documents had few mentions of Trump, the Justice Department disclosed thousands more with many references to the president, including those flight log revelations and contact book entries, and the fact that Epstein's 90-page contact book included Donald Trump and his family members, with contact information for Trump. Donald kept separately from information for Ivanka, his ex-wife Ivana, his brother Robert, and Robert's wife Blaine. When the survivor in the clip demands full transparency to be considered, and for trust to be restored with the American people, she's articulating a foundational principle of democratic governance, that power must be accountable to the people, and that accountability requires transparency, and yet what we're getting is the opposite, because survivors are feeling frustrated as they struggle to navigate the DOJ's public Epstein library in search of information about their own abuse, with anxiety running high for women who waited 30 days since passage of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, finding DOJ's online search system challenging to navigate with not much luck in coming across validating information, which means the release was structured in a way that makes it difficult even for survivors to access information about their own cases, while journalists and researchers wade through mountains of strategically redacted material. And this is not accidental, because opacity serves power, and when institutions can make transparency so technically cumbersome and so legally complicated that ordinary people can't effectively exercise oversight, then you've created a system that is democratic in rhetoric, but authoritarian in practice. The broader context here connects to what the survivor identifies as a systemic problem with how America treats survivors in the justice system, because we live in a society that rhetorically valorizes survivors while systematically failing to deliver actual justice. And this manifests in the stunning reality that Epstein survivor Marina Lacerda asked, "Who are we trying to protect, survivors or elite men that need to be put out there?" stating people need to know these are predators in the files, and when she says the DOJ, the justice system, is failing us, she's describing a justice system that has been fundamentally captured by the interests of power, where the apparatus designed to protect the vulnerable has been repurposed to shield the powerful, and this is the definitional crisis of our political moment, because legitimacy flows from justice, and when justice becomes a commodity available only to those with wealth and power and connections, the entire democratic project faces existential threat. The redactions themselves tell a story, because the law that requires the Justice Department to release the files only allows redactions under narrow circumstances, including to protect survivors' personal information, violent images or child sexual abuse material, and to temporarily withhold records that would jeopardize active federal investigations, with records explicitly not allowed to be withheld solely because they would cause embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity, which means every single one of those 680 fully redacted pages, every one of those 119 completely blacked out grand jury pages, needs legal justification, and the administration has provided none. And when pressed, they deploy vague language about ongoing review and protecting victims, while simultaneously exposing victims and protecting perpetrators. Lawmakers called the redactions excessive, with CBS News finding at least 550 pages in the initial release, fully redacted, though the Justice Department defended its release and claimed redactions made were required by law, but required by what law, and required to protect whom, because the law explicitly prohibits withholding information to prevent embarrassment, which seems to be precisely what's happening. This connects to fundamental questions about the nature of power in late capitalism, where wealth concentration has produced a class of individuals who operate in spaces beyond democratic accountability, and the Epstein case represents the perfect crystallization of this, because here was a man who for decades trafficked and abused children with the knowledge or participation of numerous powerful figures, Even after his arrest, even after his death, even after Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction, the system continues to protect the network of enablers and participants because the White House is framing the Justice Department's release of files related to Jeffrey Epstein as evidence of the administration's transparency, while criticizing Democrats, which is Orwellian doublespeak where violation of transparency requirements gets repackaged as exemplary transparency. This is how authoritarian discourse functions, by inverting meaning, until accountability becomes unaccountability, and protection becomes exposure, and justice becomes its opposite. The survivors' statement that they're releasing survivors while protecting the men who raped them or covered up the abuse is not rhetorical flourish, it's factual description of what's happening, because survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse are claiming that the Trump administration broke the law by failing to redact some of their names and withholding other documents, with multiple survivors slamming the government's recent document dump for failing to redact numerous victim identities, while also making abnormal and extreme redactions with no explanation, and survivors were told there are still hundreds of thousands of documents unreleased, constituting clear-cut violations of unambiguous law, with one survivor sending formal legal notice to Justice Department attorneys claiming the government failed to redact their name after previously withholding their file, which represents such a profound failure of basic governmental function that it borders on malicious, because how do you simultaneously claim to be protecting victims while exposing their identities and hiding perpetrators, unless protection of victims was never actually the goal? And we need to talk about what this means for the concept of justice itself, because when survivors watch the system designed to deliver accountability instead deliver more trauma, more exposure, more protection for their abusers, it teaches a lesson about power that reverberates through society, and the lesson is that power protects power, that institutions will always choose the powerful over the powerless, that claims about justice and accountability are mythology designed to legitimate fundamentally unjust distributions of power, and this is how you create the legitimacy crisis that we're currently experiencing, because Representatives Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie are attempting to hold Attorney General Pam Bondi in contempt and fine her for every day she doesn't release the full Epstein files. Khanna is worried about the DOJ's selective concealment of documents that may implicate President Trump, who was a good friend of Jeffrey Epstein, with the DOJ already criticized for redacting many names from the files, including Trump's, in a move totally devoid of transparency. The historical resonance here demands acknowledgement, because this is not the first time we've watched American institutions choose elite protection over justice, and every single time, from Nixon's pardon to the Iran-Contra immunity deals, to the decision not to prosecute Wall Street executives after Danielle Apranki, the choice to protect the powerful has eroded the foundational legitimacy of democratic governance, because democracy requires at minimum the principle that law applies equally, and when that principle becomes obviously fictional, when we can all watch in real time as different rules apply to different classes of people, the social fabric begins to tear, and what replaces it is either authoritarian acceptance that might makes right, or revolutionary rejection of the entire system, and we're watching that binary play out right now in American politics. When the survivor says this is deplorable that they're releasing some of our names with so many redactions, she's identifying the double violence of institutional failure, where the first violence is the abuse itself, and the second violence is the system's response that compounds trauma through exposure and denial, and this is what theorists of state violence describe as structural violence, where institutions themselves become instruments of harm, and the harm is not incidental but constitutive, because the institution cannot fulfill its stated purpose without fundamentally transforming the power relations that give it purpose, and the justice system cannot hold powerful abusers accountable when the justice system itself depends on maintaining the legitimacy of power structures that enable abuse. The Trump connection here is absolutely crucial, because a 2003 letter bearing Trump's name and a drawing of a woman's torso said that he and Epstein had certain things in common, and when the letter was made public in September 2025, Trump strongly denied having anything to do with it, though by 2004 Trump and Epstein had a well-known falling out, reportedly tied to a dispute over a Palm Beach mansion. Trump shrugged off photos of himself in the Epstein files as a social connection from another era, saying everybody was friendly with this guy, either friendly or not friendly, but he was around all over Palm Beach, which is the language of minimization, where extensive documented connections get reduced to casual social proximity. And this matters because the President of the United States has direct control over the Department of Justice, and when that president has his own complicated history with the subject of the investigation, the entire premise of impartial justice enforcement collapses. We need to understand this in the context of what survivors need, which is not performative gestures or controlled partial disclosures, but actual accountability. Ro Khanna put it simply, asking who raped these young girls, who covered it up, and why are they getting away with it? And that's the question that matters. And every redaction, every delay, every excuse about needing more time for review is an evasion of that question, because the government has had years to review these documents, has had the resources of the entire federal law enforcement apparatus. And what survivors are being told is that protecting powerful people's privacy and reputations matters more than delivering justice for children who were systematically abused, and this is the moral obscenity at the heart of this entire catastrophe. The clip ends with the survivor demanding that everybody restore faith, and she's identifying something profound, which is that this is fundamentally about whether institutions can be trusted, and trust once broken is extraordinarily difficult to restore. And the Trump administration is not just breaking trust, it's grinding the shattered fragments into dust, because every promise of transparency followed by heavy redaction, every deadline missed, every survivor's name left exposed while perpetrators remain hidden, every one of these choices actively destroys whatever remaining faith people have that the system can deliver justice. And when that faith dies completely, when enough people conclude that institutions are irredeemably captured by elite interests, then you get either authoritarian capture, where people accept injustice as inevitable, or revolutionary upheaval, where people decide the entire system needs to be dismantled and rebuilt. This is why the survivor's words land with such devastating force, because she's not asking for anything radical. She's asking for the most basic requirement of justice, which is that perpetrators face consequences and victims receive protection. And the fact that this basic requirement cannot be met, the fact that we're now watching the government of the United States actively violate federal law to protect the powerful, while exposing the vulnerable, tells you everything about whose interests the state actually serves. And it's not survivors, it's not children, it's not justice, it's power, protecting itself through whatever means necessary, including blatant lawlessness, because lawmakers said the Trump administration had a choice between survivors or Donald Trump, and chose Trump, and that choice reverberates through every redacted page, every missing document, every survivor left to navigate an intentionally opaque system designed to frustrate rather than facilitate their search for truth. The philosophical implications here extend to questions about the possibility of justice within existing structures, because when institutions designed to deliver accountability instead deliver protection for the powerful, it raises fundamental questions about whether reform is possible, or whether the corruption is so deep, so structural that only wholesale transformation can address it. And this is not abstract political theory. This is the lived reality of survivors watching the system fail them again, and survivors watching their names exposed while their abusers remain anonymous, and survivors watching lawmakers from both parties express outrage while the administration simply ignores legal mandates, knowing enforcement is too weak to matter. And this produces the crisis of legitimacy that threatens democratic stability, because you cannot run a democracy when half the population or more believes correctly that the justice system serves power rather than justice. We're protecting predators and not children. Those words should echo in every corridor of power, should be chanted in every protest, should frame every conversation about justice in America, because they crystallize the fundamental moral failure of this moment, and they demand a response. And the response cannot be more partial disclosures, more promises to release documents eventually, more excuses about needing time to review, because survivors have already waited decades, have already endured the system's failure, have already watched as Epstein received a sweetheart deal in Florida that let him continue abusing, have already watched as he died in federal custody under suspicious circumstances, have already watched as Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted while her client list remained hidden, and now they're watching as the Trump administration violates federal law to ensure that client list stays hidden. And if this doesn't produce mass mobilization, if this doesn't generate sustained pressure for accountability, if this doesn't result in fundamental reform, then we're accepting a system where the powerful can rape children with effective impunity, and that acceptance would make us complicit in the ongoing violence. The survivors' demand for transparency is simultaneously modest and revolutionary, because transparency is just information, but information is power, and right now power is hoarded by those who benefit from opacity. And when survivors demand to see the files about their own abuse, when they demand to know who enabled and participated in that abuse, they're demanding a redistribution of power from institutions to individuals, from perpetrators to survivors, from those who benefit from secrecy to those who've been harmed by it, and that redistribution threatens everyone who participated in or enabled or turned away from or profited from the systematic abuse of children by powerful men, and so the system deploys every tool at its disposal to prevent that redistribution, and those tools include law and bureaucracy, and claims about victim protection, strategic redactions, and delayed releases, and technical difficulties with search functions, and all of it serves the same purpose, which is protecting power, and when power feels threatened, it protects itself, and we're watching that protection happen in real time through the careful calibration of what gets revealed and what stays hidden, and who gets named and who remains anonymous. This is the fight of our generation, whether we're going to live in a society where justice is possible, or whether we're going to accept elite impunity as the permanent condition of late capitalism, and that choice is being made right now in how we respond to this grotesque failure of accountability, and the survivors are showing us the way with their clarity and courage and moral authority, and what they're asking for is not complicated, it's transparency, it's accountability, it's protection for victims and consequences for perpetrators, and the fact that these basic requirements cannot be met reveals everything about how broken our system is and how urgently it needs transformation, because if we can't deliver justice for child abuse survivors, if we can't hold powerful predators accountable, if we can't even follow explicit federal law requiring document release, then what is the justice system for except to legitimate and protect the powerful while punishing the powerless? And that's not justice, that's just power, and we need to name it as such and fight it as such, and refuse to accept it as inevitable, because justice is possible but only if we demand it relentlessly, only if we refuse to accept partial measures and empty promises, only if we stand with survivors and insist that their truth matters more than powerful people's reputations, and that's the choice before us right now, and history will judge us by how we respond.